Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. We're going to be covering the topic of implementing open source automation tools and frameworks for success. Today's event is brought to you by our friends at TestTalks, our partner Checkpoint Technologies, and Zephyr. So my name is Francis, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Zephyr. And I'm very excited to learn from these two experienced professionals that really know automation. I'll start off by introducing Joe Colantonio. He's CEO of TestTalks. Joe, can you please share a little bit about yourself, your company, and why you're excited about today's event?
Sure. Thanks, Francis. First, I want to thank Zephyr for inviting me to be a guest speaker. I'm Joe from joecolantonio.com and testtalks.com, a blog and podcast all about test automation. I'm also going to be the host of Automation Guild, which is an online conference dedicated to automation the week of January 9th. So I'm really excited to be on this webinar because I get a chance to speak about my favorite subject, which is test automation. And it's always great to share ideas with Bob, which is always fun.
Absolutely, thank you. And we're really excited about the Automation Guild as well. So for those that are tuning in today, definitely check it out. Next, Bob Cruz, one of our longtime standing partners from Checkpoint Technologies. Bob, do you mind sharing with the audience a little bit about yourself, your company, and why you're so excited about today's topic?
Absolutely. And thank you, Francis, and thank you, Joe. So again, my name is Bob Cruz, CEO and co-founder of Checkpoint Technologies. Our organization focuses primarily on quality assurance, quality control, and DevOps. We provide expert services and partner with great organizations such as Zephyr and Atlassian in providing services completely around quality assurance and quality control. And I'm very excited to be part of this, not only in teaming with you, Francis, and you, Joe, but I'm finding that the subject matter, implementing open source automation tools and frameworks, is so timely. We are constantly getting questions around that from our clients and whenever I speak at conferences. So the timing is perfect and the subject matter very relevant.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and hop right into it. So there's three things we'd like the audience to take away from today. First being open source automation tools and frameworks, the benefits of frameworks, and then best practices for implementing open source tools and frameworks. So kicking things off, Bob, is test automation still gaining traction and being widely used?
Oh, it really is, Francis. And not only that, does it still have traction, but it's gaining traction, especially with just the speed in which the IT landscape is evolving. When you look at mobile application testing and the Internet of Things especially, which I'm very passionate about, test automation is more important than ever to ensure organizations can deliver high-quality applications and systems to market as quickly as possible. Test automation has to be part of their tool set. And you brought up a great... Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, Francis. So when you look at the current slide in the evolution of test automation, I know Joe's been in IT for quite a while. I've been in it over 28 years. And the evolution when it comes to test automation has been incredible. I would say it started off, primarily with organizations developing automation solutions in-house. So they would look at their programmers, they would identify those processes that made sense to automate, and then they would use macro or whatever programming language they were proficient in and create in-house automation solutions. The problem there, it was very time-consuming. And then solutions started evolving, commercial off-the-shelf solutions such as screen scrapers, which were a step up, but still had some disadvantages, especially because they were so dependent upon screen resolution. Then we came to record and replay. Again, another step up, moved on to object recognition. We weren't as dependent upon screen resolution. Those solutions that used object recognition could typically identify an object even if there was a slight change from version to version. Maybe the location of the object changed on the screen. And then now we're seeing automation frameworks front and center, and more organizations utilizing them, especially in the shift left methodology we see becoming so prevalent. What are your thoughts on that, Joe? What would you add to that?
I think it's a great point. I think the main driver of this really is, as you said, shift left as more and more organizations move towards continuous integration, continuous deployment. They need to develop software faster and faster in order to get validation that their coding is not breaking anything. We need automated tests. So that's why I really think is the driver for more automation frameworks. Back in the day, you just have a QA resource that owned automation. That's how I used to operate. And I used to know everything about it. But now I have 8 to 10 sprint teams I work with. They all need a framework to help support them, but they don't necessarily need to be developing from scratch or understand it completely. And so you really need an automation framework in place that helps facilitate automation, that helps speed up testing and development, but not slow them down. So I definitely see that as the evolution, why we're moving towards more automation framework approaches.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you for that, gentlemen. But before we move on, we'd like to get a little bit of insight from the audience. So we'd like you to take this poll question. Does anyone have interest or experience in the following tools? Please check all that apply. So give you guys about 10 seconds to make your selections, and we will wrap it up. Thank you for your participation. So, Joe, what are your thoughts on the audience's responses?
Now, this is basically how I expected it to be, and it's kind of one of my pet peeves. I'm not sure what none of the above is, and I usually see either someone's not using a framework, or they're developing their own, or they have the other extreme where they're developing their own framework from scratch, and they're spending hours and hours of man time, but they're not leveraging automation solutions that are already out there in the open source community that they can use to help make their automation faster, the efforts quicker, without starting from scratch. So I'm hoping to see more and more people start to leverage the open source frameworks that we have rather than starting from scratch, because I think there's a big benefit to having communities that know a framework and best practices around that already, rather than going to a different organization that has their own in-house solution that may be kind of not up to speed as an open source solution that may have professional developers that spend a lot of time thinking about that solution.
Okay. Bob, does this look shocking to you, or was this in line with your thoughts?
No, it was actually quite in line with my thoughts. The solutions that we have listed are all excellent solutions, but there are so many out there on the market that I did expect the vast majority to select none of the above. One of the things I would be very curious to know from an audience perspective is the composition of different technologies and environments that the audience is utilizing, whether it's web applications, Internet of Things, mobile testing, etc. So that would be interesting to know, relevant to the solutions that they're utilizing, but that does make perfect sense.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, the audience, for your participation. So moving along, Bob, why are open source solutions so popular?
Well, when we look at the open source solutions, obviously there's a significantly lower cost of entry. And when I reference lower cost of entry, I'm really referring to direct cost. So the cost of the solution itself, as well as the cost of implementing, but sometimes there are indirect costs which are not taken into account. But even with those, the vast majority of organizations do consider the lower cost of entry when considering open source versus third party. And then also there's a greater access to open community of users. And that community, I mean, when we're talking about Selenium or some of the other open source solutions out there, that community is extremely large, which means you've got an incredible pool of expert resources, for the most part, at your disposal. And then also the ability to modify to your own needs and unlimited customization. Now, obviously, when it comes to open source solutions, that does require a higher degree of technical expertise, but I don't know about you, Joe, I found organizations more than happy to take on that requirement of a higher degree of technical expertise in order to implement open source solutions.
Yeah, Bob, that's a great point. I definitely agree. More and more organizations that I speak to on my podcast, big, large companies, I just spoke to Walmart Labs, and they do all open source. So I think it's almost like three waves. The first wave we had all commercial vendors, and then the second wave was open source. But what I'm really seeing now is that people, especially vendors, are starting to embrace open source. So I think the third wave now is we're going to have a morphing of the two, where companies like HP or Zephyr, Tools, that they work with open source solutions, but they also are not necessarily open source solutions themselves, but they help enhance the open source experience to make leveraging them quicker and easier and better. So I definitely see more people going towards open source, but I'm going to see in the future, I think, more and more companies embracing it and really giving things to enhance it that aren't available to you out of the box with an open source solution.
Yep, absolutely. And then I know when it comes to the advantages of commercial, what I would list there is that most commercial off-the-shelf solutions have a perception of greater maturity. Organizations, the software developers, they have greater skin in the game, so the perception is that they make a greater effort to fine-tune their solutions and make sure they evolve in order to be competitive with the market. But as my younger kids are more than happy to tell me, older doesn't always mean better. But again, it's all about the perception. And then also tech support, and you have a specific throat to choke. A lot of our customers, that is one thing that they love. They know that there's a support number they can call. If there's a problem, there's somebody that they can reach out to and give them a hard time and get the issue resolved quickly, because there's revenue for that vendor at stake. And then also one thing with the commercial solutions, they tend to be less fragmented, and therefore you get a greater end-to-end integration, offering more of an enterprise, an overall enterprise solution. So those are some advantages of commercial solutions. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, Bob, I definitely agree, especially on that last point. One of the biggest questions I get is I have my Selenium tests. How do I run them? How do I integrate them with another tool like I used to with ALM or a solution like that? So I think it's a big issue, actually, because a lot of times people don't even have the reporting capabilities that they would expect out of a tool. And I think the problem with that is open source, it's usually just an API like Selenium. It's not a solution per se, and you really are responsible for developing that solution. So you're integrating all a test runner, the actual test, a way to look at the reports, and that's where I think, like you said, the advantage of a commercial solution is it's all there for you. You don't have to think about it. You have an end-to-end solution, and it really is a lot easier for people just getting started, I think.
Right. You're not necessarily reinventing the wheel,
yes.
so to speak.
Right.
Right. Yep, definitely.
Well, thank you. That was a insightful conversation on the benefits and advantages of open source versus commercial. But let's shift gears and start talking about frameworks. But before we hop into frameworks, yes, audience, we'd love to hear from you again. So we have another poll. How many of the attendees have frameworks? Please make a selection. All right, we are closing the poll. Thank you for your responses. And let's kick things over to Joe. Joe, what are your thoughts on the audience's responses to this question?
Now, this is it's a little bit surprising. I'm glad to see it. I think as the years go by now, I'm seeing more and more companies actually having frameworks and know that there's a reason why they need to have it. And I see 40% they already have a framework implemented, and I think that's awesome. Earlier, maybe 2 years ago, I think that percentage was a lot lower than that. So I think this is great. I think more and more people are starting to embrace frameworks, especially like as we mentioned earlier, as more teams move towards Agile, you have more and more people that have to do automation, and you can't just have QA-centric tools. So you really do need to have a framework that embraces developers and allows them to create automation also. So it's good to see that these numbers are slightly higher than I anticipated. I'm not sure what Bob thinks. I know Bob does a lot of consulting. He sees a lot of companies in the field, so curious to know what his thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I too am surprised by this. I mean, this shows that we have the majority of the audience, their organizations are one step ahead, if you will, in regard to their embracing frameworks. And I think that that is absolutely great. I expected the never heard of a framework to be much, much higher. And as you mentioned, Joe, more and more organizations are looking for a way to implement automation, but not have to utilize such a high number of technical resources in order to do so. And that is one of the big advantages when it comes to frameworks.
Cool. Well, based on these results, it seems like just about everyone in the audience has heard of frameworks. Bob, is there a specific reason why we're hearing so much more about them?
So, I would say one of the things is that in the past several years, test automation has become, I don't like to use the word popular, but very, very necessary. Organizations realize that the market is requiring them, in order to be competitive, in order to fend off any legal issues, they've got to ensure that their applications are high quality and that they avoid risk. I mean, they don't want negative, public relations. They don't want lawsuits, etc. So in order to ensure quality, you've got to ensure that you validate the highest number of requirements you can, and for that, test automation is critical. But test automation in and of itself can be quite a burden. So that's where frameworks come in, and again, it can make the whole process easier. So that's why I think we're seeing frameworks become more and more popular. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, once again, I definitely agree with you, Bob. I think, with modern software development cycles now, the way we have to develop faster and faster, we need to do automation. And in order to do an automation, to do it quickly, fast, make the automation reusable, maintainable, you need a framework in place to help you with that. So you're not spending all your time with your tests, which are going to impact your team's velocity. And once something impacts your team's velocity, you start doing sometimes strange things in larger companies. So you definitely, I see more and more companies investing in their framework so they can make it more maintainable, easier for people to actually create test automation, but not burden them with a lot of tech overhead.
Absolutely. I mean, I can remember the days back when it wasn't uncommon for a new application or a new system to take 18 to 24 months to develop. And that's not the case now because of all these great case solutions you have out there, all the development tools. Applications are getting developed faster, which means we've got to be able to test and validate and verify just as quickly. And when it comes to frameworks, we're talking primarily about 4 types of frameworks. So there's business process, and that strategy involves creating a modular process-specific automated script for each business process. And then going down, you've got keyword-driven. So that's where you use, obviously, key phrases along with their related data, and that will then trigger events within your automated scripts. And in the upper right, you've got data-driven, where the input data determines the direction of the script. And a hybrid, obviously, is a combination of any of those. Would you expand upon that, Joe, for the audience?
Sure, but I guess what I've mostly seen lately is more of a business process type BDD approach. So if people are familiar with BDD, using tools like Cucumber and JBehave to use the language of your users in a very English-like Gherkin syntax, and then automating that Gherkin syntax so that you have business users that can create your test, and in those tests themselves, you can data drive them using example tables. You can use keywords within your framework itself. So I think it actually almost morphs all these 4 types into one. I guess something we'd probably call more of a hybrid. But I definitely see a lot of these approaches. I actually see less and less companies doing the old keyword-driven, data-driven approach and really using BDD as an automation framework, which is pros and cons to that. I definitely don't think you should use it as an automation framework per se. It's more for conversations, but the benefits are that once you have those conversations, you can automate it. And I think it actually incorporates these 4 different areas of, as we fundamentally know what frameworks are.
I agree with you 100%. And one of the things I've always felt is that when you organize your framework and you utilize a business process approach, for those learning the framework, it makes it much more intuitive because you have it organized, obviously, like the business process, which your testers should already be familiar with.
Yeah, and I actually think it integrates really beautifully with Agile, with your sprint teams. As you're planning, you're talking at a high level about your requirements, what you're going to develop before you develop it. Because the sooner you can find bugs in your software before you do any sort of coding, the better off, the faster, the better off you're going to be. So using a business process approach, I think you actually find bugs before any code's even written, and that's why I think there's a huge benefit for that also.
Great points, absolutely.
Well, thank you for that. You guys touched a little bit on the benefits. So let's talk about in depth more of the benefits that project teams can gain from using these frameworks. So Joe, could you please walk the audience through some of the benefits of frameworks?
Sure. I think there are 3 main things when I think of it, what makes up a really good automation framework, and that's reusability, maintainability, and stability. So what I mean by that is reusability is you need to be able to have a framework in place where you have either a keyword approach or a high-level API that anyone can understand so that they're not creating their own code to implement it. Now, for example, I work for a medical application, so we usually have things that a radiologist logs into an application, they look at their exams. So it's a common thing that all test cases usually have to do. And because we have 8 to 10 sprint teams, if we didn't have a framework in place, we'd have 8 to 10 people with their own methods that all logged in, that all looked at an exam. But when you make it reusable, where you just have one API that is radiologist.exam, then all those sprint teams can leverage that, so they're not creating things from scratch. So that's the big benefit of a framework. The second one is maintainability. Back in the old day, a lot of times people would hard code, say, element IDs and things within the scripts themselves. So if you had 1,000 scripts and anything changed, you'd have to go to all of those scripts to make those changes. So you really want to make sure with the framework, it really makes things more maintainable, because if you design your framework correctly and you put it into what I call a layered approach, if anything changes, you want to make it so you only have to go to one place to move. You don't want to have anyone thinking that, okay, I have to make this change in script 10, 7, and 8, and I need to go to all these other classes and make the change. So a framework helps your tests become more maintainable because you have certain areas that just are dedicated to certain places. So if anything changes, you go to that one place to make that update. And also stability. If you have an issue with an element, because you're most likely using the same method over and over again, you can make it so that method becomes more and more reliable. Where if you have this all over the place in scripts with people doing different ways to interact with an element, some may be more reliable than others. If anything changes, it could be an issue because one script may use one way and another script may use another way. So having a framework really makes it more stable because you have everything in one location, easy to maintain, and makes it more reusable. And I really think also if you design it the right way, it helps you decrease the amount of technical expertise you need on a team to create automation. And I think we have a slide later on that actually shows us, for example, here's a team that was doing behavior-driven development, so that they were almost there. But what happened is on the left-hand side, as soon as you went into what they call this gherkin statement, which was, I do a single tap on an icon. And I'm not even going to go over why this is a bad BDD statement. Let's forget about that for the moment. But so when they go in here, they're all of a sudden hit by a bunch of code. So it's almost like someone that looks at this needs to be a coder, and you want to avoid that. Also, if you see here, I know it's hard to read, they have hard-coded element IDs for different elements that they're interacting with. So if any of these element IDs changed, they had literally 1,000 tests with classes everywhere. They would have to manually go in and make these changes. So I made them refactor this out, put it all into one class that handles the toolbar, that has a page object, and has that element ID specified once. So if anything changed, you go to that one thing. And here's on the right-hand side, which is the rewrite. It's still not optimal, but I think it's a lot more readable. It's a lot more maintainable. And let's be honest, I've been doing automation for 16 years. The most amount of time that I take with automation usually is the readability of looking at a framework. I'm reading code mostly more than I'm adding to code. And so you really want to strive to make your tests as readable as possible, your methods as readable as possible. It may seem trivial, but when it breaks, when you have a readable API and you have it reported in a way that's readable, it makes it so much easier to debug. The quicker you can debug, the better off you're going to be also. And that's why I think you really need to design for readability as one of your key motivations for creating a framework also. Bob, I'm not
Joe,
sure.
I agree with, yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think back to my COBOL days, and I remember we had a term for code which was just in a straight line and non-readable, and that was spaghetti code. But, you know, and any time you can help ease and decrease maintenance, that's a good thing, because that just helps you maximize your return on investment with the automation solution, with automation in general, and with the framework. And, you know, face it, folks, I mean, we're all techies on the call, and we all are very passionate about what we do. But when it comes right down to it, it is about the business, and the business has to realize a return on investment. And that also transcends to higher quality for your application. So maintainability, good comments, good structure in your code is essential.
Great. Well, so Bob, what are the skills necessary to use frameworks?
So the skills that I would go with, Francis, is, I mean, you want to have strong abstract skills. When interviewing engineers, I actually give them different types of abstract tests. So they have to be able to, and I hate to overuse the cliche, but think outside the box. You've got to have some programming skills. And the extent in which you've got to have them really depends on what your role is going to be in regard to developing and implementing the framework. And above all else, you've got to be a good tester, because one of the key phrases I've always used is to use the carpenter analogy. You know, you can give the worst carpenter in the world the best hammer, and that individual is still a really bad carpenter. So you've got to know how to test. Those are some skills that I would emphasize.
Yeah, I just want to definitely jump in here. And I think testing, having the ability to know what to test, how to test, and why to test is really important. I'm actually seeing that almost as a lost skill as we go to these agile teams. And why that's important is not only is it important to know what to automate, but I think what's even more important is what not to automate, or what doesn't make a good thing, a good automation test case critical. And I think having testing skills, or the IQ of what testing is and QA is, really is critical.
Joe, that's a great point. I don't know about you, but I always get nervous when I go into a client and they, you know, and right away they say, oh, we're going to automate 100% of our test cases. I mean, you and I both, Joe, we love automation. We absolutely love it. But we both know that manual testing is key, exploratory testing, you know, that's got to be part of your toolkit, and so on. So you made a great point. You've got to make sure that you automate what should be automated, leave manual what should be left manual. That's a great point. And then, you know, right now we're showing just some different design examples in regard to what the business user is going to see. So after you've got that code, that engine developed in your framework, you utilize an interface, which is typically and quite often an Excel spreadsheet. So in this, you'll see that the code is symbolized over on the right, and then over on the left is the interface which the testers utilize in order to automate their test cases. And we've got here, what it shows is 4 different parameters. So an input parameter in one column, and then you see in another column, that is where different decision parameters would be specified, whether or not to click that specific object. You'll see that the business process themselves are indicated in the sheets, the worksheets of the spreadsheet. And then down in the bottom image, you can see that one of the columns is the expected parameter, in other words, the expected result. So that helps to make your automated test very, very robust. It allows you to execute and utilize this framework and this spreadsheet for just a huge variety of conditions and scenarios.
Great. And Joe, what exactly are we looking at over on the right? Is that
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. So it's the same concept. You have a business-facing, what I call a business-facing layer for our test. And so this is an example of BDD. When you use Cucumber and tools like Cucumber, you can create your test in a text and you can use English-like syntax. So what we're looking at is a test case that's written in an English-like language that anyone can read. So your product owners, your developers, your testers, you can get three amigos at the beginning of your sprint to talk about, okay, what do we need to test? And someone could document it in English-like syntax. And then once you have that, you can then automate it. So this is the BDD front end. It also takes some of the concepts we talked about earlier about data driving us. So this is an example of an example table where this will run this test multiple times using those examples in a loop until it meets all those conditions. So it really goes to that layered approach that I kind of hinted on earlier in the call. And when you're developing a framework, I think it's really critical that you do create a framework that is separated out into layers. And so what I've done is I've created an example of, we use behavior-driven development. So we call that a user-facing test that anyone could write. It's in an English-like syntax. And that's what I call our test, or our dot feature files, our dot stories. And they're written in then English-like syntax. And then what those do, those call in the background actual code. So we'll call a class. But even that layer, which I call a what step, so you have a feature file, which is a text file. You click on one of those given statements, and they go to a piece of code. And that first layer of code is a really high-level API. So it's in a way, it's written in such a way that anyone could write it. It doesn't need to be a developer. There's no instantiation of variables. It's just something as simple as radiologist dot, and then all the different actions a radiologist can perform. And then say someone did a radiologist.login. When you click on login, that calls another step. So it's another class that I'm calling a how step. And that handles all the implementation type details. You want to keep your implementation details out of your test when you're creating frameworks, because say something changed from a drop-down to a checkbox. If you have that hard-coded in your test, you'd have to manually change that in all your tests. So you want to make sure all your implementation details in a lower level place, which I call a how step. So if it ever changes, you just go to that one place to make that change. And then how steps call things I think people are most familiar with when they're doing Selenium, and that's page objects. And your page objects hold an abstract of what your particular page may be, or a component, and it holds all the element IDs that actually your test used to interact with that particular object. So if an element ID ever changes, you know, if you have a login page object, anything changes on that login, where do you go? You go to the login page object, that one place. You don't have to mess with any of your tests. You're just messing with one little component. And what's great about this approach is it doesn't matter what technology you're using. So right now we're using Selenium. We also test APIs using Rest Assured, but our tests don't need to know that. Our testers don't need to know that because they're writing things at a high level, and they're implementing APIs I call low-level technology that really, this tech layer is what developers end up creating. So it's also great for collaboration. So your developers are creating the infrastructure in the background for the code itself, and they're creating an API that's really, really readable to your more non-technical users or QA resources that really are into the testing piece of it, and they can leverage that. And then this then calls whatever technology you're using behind the scenes. So if for some reason we said, hey, we're not going to use Selenium anymore, we're going to use, I don't know, SmartBear or some, or LeanFT, we can get rid of Selenium and plug it in, and we wouldn't have to change any of our tests because we use this layered approach. So that's how I think, when you're creating a framework, you should be thinking about layers, how you're going to divide things up, and make it so it's as easy as possible. So if anything changes, you go to that one place to make that change.
Joe, you just made a great point. You just made a great point in regard to the Selenium and the utilization of Selenium as the engine, if you will, is transparent to your testers, and that you could switch it out. So the audience needs to think about the fact that the framework should not, and typically does not if it is well designed, should not tie you to the engine that is used. So that if at some point in time you wanted to switch out to a different solution, yes, there'd be a level of effort with that, but it's not impossible, and it's not an overwhelming level of effort. So great point, Joe.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, like you said, you've probably seen what we've implemented back in the days, a QTP, like keyword framework. Well, because we have all these tests now in keywords, it's not that hard for me to transfer them into a BDD Java thing. I'm just writing the code that implements those keywords. But all those tests would still stay the same. I don't have to touch them. So it makes it a lot easier. So that's a great point that you brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit out of order. There's a good question that an audience person asked in regards to what is the difference between TDD and BDD?
So it's a good question. The way I think of it is a TDD is more of a developer-like activity, or you can use it for automation. But for TD, usually what typically happens is you have a developer, and hopefully you have good developers that before they write a line of code, they write a test. So they may have a method that's called, I don't even know, create widget A, populated with data or something. But before they write any code, they write a test for it. And so when they run that test, it's going to fail, so it turns red. So then what they do is they write code in order to implement it to make that test turn green. So that's why they call it green-red refactor. It's a TDD approach. It helps developers develop their test. Where BDD is more outside, it's more about a user level, where you're developing tests from a top-down approach. So your developers would still be using TDD to develop their application, but using BDD to develop your test. Hopefully that made sense, but it's TDD is typically more of a developer-driven activity, and BDD is usually a higher-level business-facing type activity. But they're usually used in conjunction.
Yeah, I think you did a great job there, Joe, because I mean, I'll just kind of recap it and tell me if I've got it right on what you were saying. Basically, a developer on test-driven development, they're going to be looking at the tester, how they would test it, and that is going to drive how they develop it. And that's making an assumption, of course, that the tester understands the requirements, understands the business processes, etc. But the developer is using the tester. Whereas on BDD, the developer is really looking at the end user and their behavior and how they're going to use the end system, use the application, etc. And that drives a lot of their development efforts.
Absolutely. And I just want to hone in on one little point there. Yeah, when a developer does it, they're usually doing it at a unit level. And we'll probably get into this later. The more unit tests you have, the more low-level tests you have, the better off you're going to be. So automation isn't necessarily just end-to-end. It also are these other activities. So this is a great question about TDD. So you want your developers to be creating these unit tests because those are usually the ones that run faster, quicker. So when they check code in, they get a quicker feedback to let them know whether or not they broke something. The quicker they can get feedback, the better off you're going to be because they'll be able to know, okay, I know I changed X, so I need to go back and change it. So it gives them faster feedback. So it is used for more unit level tests. So you get the benefit of a low level test that are created before even any code's created. So it's awesome all around.
Yep, definitely.
And because we mentioned Selenium, I want to get one more audience question in before we move along. The question is, can you use a Selenium IDE in writing your framework?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know, Bob, I don't mean to jump in. I really highly discourage anyone from using that approach. It's almost like record and playback. It's fine if it's a throwaway script or if you're trying to learn an application. Maybe you use a record type IDE type script and then you export it into Java and then you modify it. I wouldn't use it as your only approach. I may use it for more exploratory type testing to try to understand your application, but I highly would not to rely on IDEs that record and playback, just because, like we said, from a framework perspective, a lot of that stuff is going to be hard-coded in your scripts, and it actually goes against some of these principles that we touched upon. Bob, any thoughts on that?
I agree 100%. It's, a lot of times I like to say the question isn't whether or not you can, it's whether or not you should. Right. So technically, can you? Absolutely. Should you? No, because of what you just said. I mean, if you're going to do a framework, you want to make sure that you take advantage of the maintainability and the robustness that a good, solid framework provides you. So I agree, and we preach the exact same thing, Joe. We would not advise that.
Right, and I don't want to go over time here, but it's almost like automation is development I believe it's software development. You never expect your developers to record and play back code they're creating. So I don't know why we always think that, oh, we're testers or this is automation, it's less than. You should be using the same exact approaches, best practices that your developers use to develop code to create your automation, because in a sense you're developing an application that tests another application, and you should use all those same best practices to create your test automation frameworks.
And Joe, what we'll normally do is actually, we'll record the very basic initial process, and then obviously we dive into the script that was generated and start enhancing it significantly. So I mean, it saves us from typing, and you know, Joe, I know you're not like me. Personally, I type, I think, 10 words per minute. So, you know, you can imagine that if I'm typing stuff in, it takes a while. But recording and then enhancing the script significantly, you know, is one thing you could look at. But don't leave it at just the straight record and replay component that was created.
Great. Well, thank you. So, so far we've covered open tools and frameworks, the benefits of frameworks, but before we jump into best practices for implementing automation tools and frameworks, we have one more question of the audience. Please take this poll. What skills do you think your team is missing to leverage frameworks? Okay, and we are going to be closing the poll now. Well, looking at this data, it seems like everyone knows what's missing or their specific challenges. Joe, is there anything you'd like to touch on based on these responses?
Yeah, I think the one thing, and it just might be my situation, is culture. A lot of times I find that management may be talking, hey, we're going to use Agile, we're going to use best practices, we're going to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, and they don't realize that your developers aren't buying into it. And if your developers aren't buying into automation, you can't rely on just a tester anymore to do your automation. So I've been seeing a lot of culture issues. I'm kind of surprised that 17%. I'm not shocked by the automation expertise. I've been seeing, even just interviewing people, I have a hard time filling positions to find people with automation skills. So to me, that's not shocking, but I thought culture would be a little bit higher. I'm not sure what Bob, once again, Bob works with a lot of different companies. I just work for one large company typically, so maybe my perception's a little skewed.
Joe, I mean, to be honest with you, I honestly thought both management buy-in and culture were going to be a lot higher than they are in this particular poll. So I would assume that the reason they're not higher is, and I'll go back to the previous poll question, and that is so much of the audience either has a framework in place or in the process of implementing a framework. But typically, if an organization does not have a framework and they're considering it, I've always found management buy-in and culture to be two of the biggest challenges for organizations. So, good question. That was a good poll question.
All right. Well, we're now into the final stretch of our webinar, Best Practices for Implementing Automation Tools and Frameworks. Joe, this question goes to you. What are the best practices for implementing automation tools and frameworks?
I think we touched on it a little, and I really think test automation is software development. So all those best practices of development, dry, don't repeat yourself, keep it simple, reusability, are all the practices that you would want to use within your automation frameworks also. I think the more important issue is really you want to have some main goals for your framework that will help drive those best practices. And I think the three main goals for that are, there needs to be a collaborative approach. You can't just have one person on your sprint that's dedicated to automation. And it needs to be a whole team approach, and it needs to be developed in such a way where your developers are using languages, IDEs that they're familiar with, so you don't have a disconnect between testers and developers. So it needs to be collaborative. That would be a best practice. By having that collaboration, you get the best practices of developers, because developers know how to develop. And once again, test automation is what? It is development. So that is one of the main best practices. Also fast. Your tests need to be fast. And what I mean by that is, as we go towards developers creating code and then going into continuous integration environment, they need feedback fast. We can't wait like we used to, maybe run the test overnight, come in and see the results. You need quick feedback, because if the code checked in is broken, you want to make sure you get it out of your build as soon as possible. So the tests need to be as fast as possible. So I really think as automation framework, not everything should be an end-to-end fat automation script. You should try to focus in on lower unit tests, you should have integration tests, you should have API tests, REST tests. You should do a lot of mocking, so you're not necessarily doing all end-to-end testing. That'll save you a lot of time. Keep your tests headless whenever possible. And your tests need to be reliable. And this is important because it doesn't matter how good your framework is. If your tests are flaky and they're failing, especially when you're using continuous integration and developers are going in and say, oh, it failed, and then they run it on their machine and it says it works for them, they're going to totally discredit the test automation going forward. You're going to lose buy-in, and once that happens, forget it. It becomes really a nightmare to get everyone back on board. So once again, you need collaboration that will help drive best practices. Tests need to be fast, so if you're using developers, best practices that way, that'll help your tests be fast. And they need to be reliable, so you have everyone that trusts when a test fails that they know, okay, team, sprint team, this test failed. We know it's usually reliable. Let's hop in and find that defect before it goes live. Bob, I don't know, any thoughts around that also?
Yeah, well, one thing I would add is, all of these benefits, I would say to everybody, pay attention to these because these will enable you, if you follow these, if you plan accordingly and utilize just these 3 best practices, one of the great benefits is you'll be able to utilize your framework sooner and start executing automated tests through your framework that much quicker. I always have to shake my head whenever I see an organization has spent 6 to 8 months implementing a framework, and during that time, and I'm sure you've seen this, Joe, during that time they have not executed a single automated test through that framework. So, I mean, that is just a massive effort that you're not taking advantage of for a long period of time. So pay attention to these best practices that we've listed.
Oh, Bob, wait, that's just such a great point. I just need to go off on a quick rant. That's such a great point. I've seen companies that they have a team dedicated to automation, and they've been developing for a year without any feedback from the users. So it is software development, so we should treat it just like any agile project. Let's do a sprint. Let's get it in the hands of our developers as fast as possible, get that input and make the changes, because it's just like anything. The longer you wait to get that input, if you make assumptions, the harder it's going to be to make changes. So that's a great point, Bob. I mean, that is one of my pet peeves, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, you bet.
Great. Well, the question lines are burning up, so we want to get to the audience. But before we do, just wanted to quickly recap on what we covered today. And while I read off the next question from the audience, we'd greatly appreciate your input. Your constructive criticism means a lot to us. So any input on what you like, what you didn't like about this webinar will be seriously considered as we refine our webinars moving forward. So I want to thank the audience for participating today. And I'm going to go ahead and read the first question. And while I do, please participate in the poll. So question for the panel. Can you use testing frameworks for testing high-level applications?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is Bob. I would say, absolutely. There's no reason you cannot. Again, you need to develop a strategic plan, make sure you're realizing a return on investment in doing so. Joe, what would you respond to that?
I apologize. Could you just repeat the question one more time, Francis?
Yeah, it's can we use testing frameworks for testing high-level applications?
Yes, so I agree with what Bob said. You definitely can. Once again, you just need to think about your design, what your end case is before you develop your framework, and you definitely can use it for that particular business case.
Okay. Next question. Should unit component testing be part of automation, or should you only cover functional tests?
So I think it should be part of your automation strategy in general. I think there's a discussion going on in the test community as, is automation testing? I think, automation should be used for whatever can be automated. So if you're doing unit level test, and it could be automated, automate it. And I think it makes up a healthy, you want a full scenario, you want a nice portfolio of tests. And I think having a healthy set of unit tests, you're going to get better, quicker, faster feedback and benefits from having more unit tests than you would from end-to-end tests, because even if you have the best framework in the world, end-to-end tests tend to be flaky regardless. I mean, my 16 years experience, I would tend to avoid end-to-end tests whenever possible. So whenever you could do a headless or a unit level test, I'd say go for it.
And I agree with Joe. I would want to emphasize one of the things that Joe and I mentioned during the webinar, and that is if you're going to use it for unit testing, make sure that your developers understand the good candidates for automation. In other words, what they should automate and what they should not. So back when I was a developer, there were certainly different functionality that I would have to test consistently numerous times, and those were good candidates for automation, for unit tests. So it's something you can look at, and then those unit tests, look at flipping them over to the quality assurance team so that they can implement them in the regular framework.
And another point is I use them as quality gates within our continuous integration environment. So at a minimum, all the unit tests need to pass before a developer could check in code. So because they're the unit tests, they're quick, they're faster, it really gives you greater confidence in knowing that the code that's being checked into your branch is going to be of working quality.
Great, thank you. Got another question. Is it possible to use page object patterns with Cucumber or BDD?
Absolutely. So BDD is just an approach to doing testing, or it's not even for testing, it's for collaboration. But one of the benefits is you get automation out of it. So because it uses developer languages like Java or pretty much any language, Python, whatever, and because Selenium is an API that you use language bindings for Java, so any of those, doesn't matter what Cucumber implementation or flavor you're using, you can get advantage of the page object because page object is just a developing best practice. So Cucumber utilizes a programming language, so then you can take advantage of any sort of development practice like a page object.
All right. Bob, did you want to address that one, or should we move on to the next question?
No, Joe captured it all. That was perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good. Well, I think this question was asked by multiple people, so I think the audience is dying to hear it. There are so many automation tools in the market, from open source to commercial. Which ones do you suggest is easiest for a person who has minimal coding experience?
So I'll be honest with you, Francis. I'm reluctant to endorse any specific project solution. I feel like there are numerous out there that are easy to use for testers without any strong. I mean, more and more we're starting to see the scriptless solutions. What you have to figure out with the scriptless solutions is not simply are they easy to learn for a non-programmer person, but are they robust enough to accomplish your testing objectives? And as well, if you have or are implementing a framework, how are they going to fit into the design of your framework? So those are some things that you have to look at that I believe transcend the requirement that they be easy for a person that does not have programming experience. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
No, I agree. I know it seems like a cop-out to say it depends, but it really does just depend on your organization, what your goals are, and what your culture is. I think teams need to be honest with what their culture is. So if you have people that aren't testers, and you're not dedicated to having developers help support your automation, I think you may have an issue. And so you may select a tool that doesn't require as much programming skills. But I guess it all depends. If someone really wanted an honest answer from me, like what would I choose or what would I take a look at first, maybe? I'm not saying I'm not endorsing this, but if you don't have many programming skills, I would look at a tool like Robot Framework. I'm surprised more people don't use it. It uses Python. It uses keyword. You can use keyword testing approach. It has all modules already built into it, so you can test things other than web applications. So it is really a robust framework, and it seems to be geared towards testers. It was designed by a tester, Pika Clark, who I talked to on TestTalks. So I would have people just at least check that out. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying that's a good place to start. If you actually have testers that are getting new to automation and they want to use a user-friendly language like Python, or they want to take advantage of things that already exist like modules within that makes keyword-driven approaches that already exist in an existing framework, I would take a look at the robot framework.
Sounds good. Well, I think we have enough time for one more question. Can you use the same framework for functional regression tests?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, that's actually what I would probably key in and focus on first from a biggest bang for your buck perspective. So that's what I would actually target first. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yes and no. So, I mean, it depends if you're doing brand new development. Of course, you can't do regression tests. But I would focus on, like you said, your regression tests first to help build up the framework if you had a lot of tech debt already. And yes, you can use it for regression. We started development from scratch, so we didn't have any regression tests yet. And so, but what happens is because we want to build up a pipeline, a quality gate within our continuous integration, we tag things as a smoke and as a regression test, saying, these core tests need to pass on this environment or all these three environments, and then we have our other tests that can run against just one environment to give us certainty knowing everything works. So yes, you can reuse it for smoke tests using different methods like tagging, which seems to be one of the better approaches when you're using something like continuous integration.
Yep. And one of the other things I would add is we didn't talk about it during the webinar, but I find a lot of times our clients forget the fact that automation is great in regard to test preparation, test cleanup, backup and restores, all of those other tasks and processes that go along with testing itself. So, that is something that you should also be looking at designing into your framework.
Oh, that's a great point. We actually didn't touch on this. It's really important, especially test data. If you can automate something, automate it. It doesn't necessarily need to be a test, but if it can assist you in testing faster, even manual tests, like say you have a new environment, but you need to have 50 users set up that have rights for something, and you can automate that, automate it, and then let your manual testers go at it. But absolutely, whatever you can automate it. Doesn't necessarily need to be an end-to-end test. So definitely agree on that point, Bob. Great point there.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It was a very valuable discussion. I hope the audience found it as insightful as I did. Just some housekeeping rules. We're going to go ahead and send the recorded session of today's webinar to everyone who registered. Also, for all the questions that we didn't get to, we will get those answered as well and follow up with the individuals one by one. So again, Joe, Bob, thank you very much for your time. It was great, and look forward to doing a future one.
Oh, same here, Francis. And I want to emphasize to everybody on the webinar that if you happen to be at Atlassian Summit next week, I know Francis is going to be there. I'm going to be there in a booth. Please stop by and say hi, and feel free to ask any questions or give us feedback on the webinar.
I want to do a quick plug also, automationguild.com if you want to go to a conference dedicated 100% to test automation, all online, January 9th, week of January 9th. Go check it out. Thank you, Francis, for having me on, and thank you, Bob. It's always awesome, a lot of fun when we get together, so thank you.
Oh, you bet, Joe, and thank you, Francis.
Thanks. Everyone have a good day.
Bye now.
Thanks.